They nominated me for the Oscar, and then they made absolutely sure I had nowhere to go with it. That is the story of my career in one sentence. Everything else I am going to tell you, every room I walked into, every role I fought for, every door that opened just wide enough for me to see what was on the other side before it closed again. All of it comes back to that sentence. I was the first Black woman nominated for Best Actress at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, 1954. People still talk about that nomination as though it was a victory. And in one sense, yes, it was historic. It was real. It mattered in ways that extended far beyond my own career, in ways that I understood even then. Sitting in that theater, in a gown that I had chosen very carefully, because I knew that every camera in that building would find me. But here is what history doesn't tell you about being the first. Being first doesn't mean the industry is ready for you. It means you arrived before it was ready. And there is a specific kind of loneliness in that position, in being the proof of possibility in a system that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to be possible. I made history in Hollywood. And then I spent the rest of my career watching the industry I had just made history and find every available way to make sure that history didn't change anything at all. This is what that looked like from the inside. I want to tell you where I came from before I tell you what Hollywood did with where I arrived, because the distance between those 2 points is part of the story, and I'm not interested in telling only the part of the story that begins with the famous name, Cleveland, Ohio, 1922. My mother, Ruby, was a woman who believed in performance the way some people believe in religion, completely, without reservation, as the thing that organized life and gave it meaning. She put my sister Vivian and me on stage before we were old enough to understand what a stage was. I want to be clear that this is not a complaint. The stage was where I lived. It was where I made sense of the world. It was where I felt from the very beginning, from the first time an audience responded to something I was doing, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We performed everywhere, church halls, radio programs, clubs that probably shouldn't have had children in them. Vivian and me and our friend Etta, working the circuit of venues that were available to Black performers in the 1930s, which was a significantly smaller circuit than the one available to everyone else. I understood this early, not as injustice, not yet, not with that word, not with that clarity, but as geography. There were places we went and places we didn't go, and the reason we didn't go to certain places was not discussed because it didn't need to be. Everyone understood. By the time I arrived in Hollywood, really arrived, as a young woman trying to build something durable out of the talent and the training and the years of performance that had been my entire childhood. I understood the geography of the industry the way I understood the layout of a stage, where the light was, where the exits were, and where the walls were that you could not walk through no matter how well you performed. The roles available to Black actresses in Hollywood in the 1940s were not a reflection of talent. They were a reflection of what the industry had decided Black women were for: maids, servants, the friend who exists to support the white lead, the background presence, the comic relief, the character whose name you don't remember when you leave the theater. I was offered those roles. I turned them down, not because I was naive about what that refusal would cost. I was not naive. I had been working in this industry long enough to understand the cost structure of professional noncompliance, but because accepting them would have meant agreeing with the industry's assessment of what I was worth. And I did not agree. Let me tell you about the rules, not the written ones, the contracts, the studio policies, the official structures of the Hollywood system that have been well documented by people who study this industry. The other rules, the ones that operated in the space between what was legal and what was done. In old Hollywood, in the golden age, in the studio era, in the system that controlled everything from what got made to who got to be in it, there was an understanding. Black performers could work. Black performers could, under the right circumstances, achieve a certain level of recognition. But leading roles, the kind of roles that built careers, that put a name above the title, that created the specific commercial infrastructure of a major Hollywood star, those were understood to belong to a different category of performer. The rule was never written down. It didn't need to be written down. It operated through 1,000 small decisions: casting choices, contract offers, publicity allocations, the films that got greenlit and the films that didn't, the directors who wanted to work with you, and the ones who suddenly found they had scheduling conflicts. Through the accumulated weight of an industry-wide understanding that was so complete, so thoroughly embedded in how every decision was made, that challenging it felt less like fighting a policy and more like arguing with the weather. I argued with the weather. For years, I argued with it, through the roles I chose, through the performances I gave, through the sheer quality of work that I put on screen in films that the industry was not designed to fully support. And in 1954, something happened that I could not have predicted and that the industry had not prepared itself for. The weather broke for a moment, just long enough to show everyone what was possible. And then the industry looked at what had happened, looked at the nomination, the coverage, the audience response, the historic significance of what I had achieved, and made a decision. Not with a memo, not with a meeting, not with anything as legible as a formal policy, with silence. And in Hollywood, silence has always been the most effective language. I need to tell you about the film, not just the film, the experience of it. What it felt like to be inside a project that was, from the first day of production, unlike anything I had been part of before. The film was a musical adaptation of a classic opera with an all-black cast, directed by the director, produced by a major studio. The role of the lead role was the kind of role that I had spent my entire career waiting to be given the chance to play. Not a maid, not a servant, not a supporting presence orbiting someone else's story. The center, confident, magnetic, dangerous, a woman whose desire and intelligence and sheer force of personality drove the entire narrative. A woman who made choices, who paid for those choices, who is complicated and real in the way that leading characters in major Hollywood productions were complicated and real. I knew from the moment I read the script that this was it, and I gave it everything. Every technique I had developed through 20 years of performance, every emotional truth I could access, every physical choice, every vocal decision, every moment of the character that I understood from the inside because I had been preparing for this role without knowing it was coming my entire professional life. The filming was hard. The director was demanding, genuinely demanding, in the way that directors who believe in what they are making push the people they are working with past what those people believed they could do. I was grateful for that. I wanted to be pushed. I wanted this film to be undeniable, and it was. The audiences responded in the way that audiences respond when something on screen is operating at a level they haven't seen before. The reviews, the serious reviews, the ones written by people who understood what they were looking at, were extraordinary. And then came the nomination, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, Best Actress, my name, on that list. For the first time in the history of that award, a Black woman's name was on that list. I sat with that for a long time. I still sit with it, because it was real, genuinely, historically, permanently real, and because what came after it was also real, and the gap between those two realities is the story I am here to tell. The night of the Academy Awards. I want to describe it carefully because it has been described in many ways by many people who were not there. And the versions that get passed down tend to emphasize either the triumph or the tragedy. And the truth is that it was both simultaneously in the specific way that only old Hollywood could produce both things in the same evening. I wore a strapless gown, champagne colored. I had thought about that choice the way I thought about every choice that would be photographed, which is to say, completely understanding that every image produced that night would be reproduced, distributed, discussed, and that I was not just attending an awards ceremony. I was making a statement about what Black women looked like at the center of Hollywood's most important night. The room was full of the most famous people in the entertainment industry: directors, producers, stars, the entire apparatus of the golden age of Hollywood assembled in one place. And I was there, not as a presenter, not as a performer brought in for a specific musical number, as a nominee, as someone who might win. I did not win. The winner that year won that year for the winning film. And I want to be clear that this is not a story about the Academy's decision, because the Academy's decision was made by voters who had seen both performances and had their reasons. What this story is about is what happened after, what the industry did with the nomination, with the history, with the proof, visible, undeniable, permanently recorded, that a Black woman could carry a major Hollywood film at the level that warranted the industry's highest recognition. What the industry did with all of that was the most important thing that happened to me that night. And what it did was almost nothing. After the film, I expected the phone to ring. Not because I was naive. I want to say that again, because I think the narrative that gets constructed around women who encounter the industry's limits often includes a version of naivety that is insulting to the intelligence of the person being described. I was not naive. I expected the phone to ring because that is what happens when a film is successful and a performance is recognized at the highest level the industry offers. The phone rings, scripts arrive, meetings are scheduled, the machinery of a major career begins to operate because that is what it does when the investment has been validated. I had validated the investment. I had given the industry everything it needed to build a major star. The phone did not ring the way it should have rung. The scripts that came were not the film scripts. They were not leading roles in major studio productions with the budgets and the directors and the promotional machinery that the industry deployed for its most valuable properties. They were the other kind, smaller, peripheral. The roles that said, "We recognize you exist. We will use your name where your name is useful, but we are not going to build around you the way we build around the actresses whose careers we have decided to invest in." And the reason that was never stated, that was communicated entirely through the specific texture of what was offered and what wasn't, was not my talent. Everyone in that industry knew my talent. The reason was the same reason it had always been. The industry had decided what Black women were for, and the nomination had not changed that decision. It had complicated it, made it slightly more expensive, slightly more difficult to maintain in the face of the visibility that the film had created. But it had not changed it. I had broken a record. I had done something no one had ever done before. I had stood in that theater in that champagne gown and proved to every person watching that the wall they had built was not about talent, was not about ability, was not about anything that could be measured by the quality of the work. And the industry looked at that proof and built the wall a little higher. There's a particular kind of trap that the industry built for me after the film, and I want to name it precisely because it has been replicated for every Black performer who has ever achieved visibility in a system not designed for their success. The trap is this: the nomination made me too famous for the roles I had been offered before. Going back to secondary characters, to the supporting presence, to the roles that existed to serve someone else's story, that was no longer possible without it being noticed, commented on, understood as the statement it was. but the industry was not prepared to offer me what came next. The leading roles in major productions, the films built around my presence, the career architecture that the nomination should have triggered. So I existed in the gap, too famous for small, too black in the industry's calculation for big. I want you to understand what that gap feels like from the inside. It feels like being suspended, like the floor beneath you has been removed and the ceiling above you has been lowered, and the space you are left with is just barely enough to exist in, but not enough to move. The offers that came were contradictions. Films overseas, in Europe, where audiences and studios operated under different assumptions about who could carry a film. I took some of those. They were good work, real work, the kind of work that reminded me why I had spent my entire life in this industry. But they were not Hollywood, and Hollywood was where the history had been made. Hollywood was where the nomination had happened. Hollywood was where the industry I had spent my entire career trying to crack had finally briefly cracked open. And Hollywood was where the crack had sealed itself shut again before I could get through it. The financial consequences were real. I want to say that directly because this story is often told in purely symbolic terms, as a story about recognition, about representation, about what the nomination meant for Black performers in the history of the industry. All of that is true, but there was also a person living inside the symbol, a person with professional expenses and a lifestyle that had been built around the career the nomination should have produced, and that the industry had decided not to produce. The gap between what I was and what I was being offered was not just symbolic, it was financial, it was professional, it was daily. I want to step back from the personal account and name what the system did. Not to me specifically, though it did it to me specifically, but structurally, as a policy, as the ordinary operation of an industry that had built its success on a set of assumptions about who audiences were and what they wanted to see and who got to be at the center of the stories being told. The studio system, in its golden age, operated on a simple commercial logic. Give audiences what they've always wanted. Don't risk what's working. Manage change slowly enough that it never disrupts the machine. I was a disruption, not because I wanted to be. I did not come to Hollywood to be a symbol or a disruption or a representative of anything larger than my own talent and my own ambition. I came to act, but the nomination had made me into something the industry didn't have a category for, a Black leading actress with Academy recognition. The industry had categories for everything. It had been building categories for 30 years. It did not have a category for that. And instead of building one, instead of looking at what the film had proven about audiences and what they were willing to embrace, instead of following the evidence that the nomination provided, the industry did what industries do when they encounter something they don't have a category for. They waited for it to go away. They managed the disruption through inaction, through the specific, deliberate, institutional inaction of an industry that understood that it didn't need to say no. It just needed to not say yes. And not saying yes, over time, has the same effect as a closed door. You just can't point to the person who closed it. There are things the industry took that it never gave back. I want to name them, not for sympathy. I am not asking for sympathy, but because unnamed things have a way of disappearing from the record. And I am not interested in disappearing from the record. The decade after the film should have been the decade of my greatest work. I was in my 30s. I had the technique, the presence, the recognition, the proven commercial viability of a major star. That decade existed. I lived it. But I did not live it as the career it should have been. I lived it in the gap, in the space between what the nomination had made possible and what the industry had decided to make real. The financial pressure accumulated. Projects that were promised didn't materialize. Relationships that were complicated by the specific stress of a career that wasn't delivering what it should have delivered. The industry moved on, not dramatically, not with a statement, just the way industries move on toward the next thing, the next star, the next property that promised return on investment. And I became, gradually, the thing that old Hollywood was very good at producing. The cautionary tale that isn't recognized as a cautionary tale until long after. The person at the center of it is no longer around to correct the record. In 1965, I died. I was 42 years old, and for years after, for a long time after, my story was told in the way that Hollywood prefers to tell the stories of women who encountered the system and did not survive it, as tragedy, as personal failure, as the inevitable result of a woman who burned too bright and couldn't sustain it. That version is not the truth. The truth is that I was one of the most talented performers of my generation, which the industry acknowledged with a nomination in a system that acknowledged the talent and then declined to use it. That is not personal failure. That is institutional policy.